Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Daniel Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online, who is in for Jim Garrity this week. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. All of it brought to you yet again by Hopsy. Right now, go to tryhopsy.com/martini to get the sub-home draft machine, 2 mini kegs of beer, 2 Hopsy glasses, and free membership in the monthly beer club for just $99. Tryhopsy.com/martini. A little bit more on that in just a moment. So, Dan, we'll get to the Bush funeral in our second martini. But let's talk about our good martini, because as we talked about in a couple of cases yesterday, the 2020 Democratic field is winnowing just a tad. Deval Patrick is out. Michael Avenatti out now. Now we have news about Elizabeth Warren, who, as far as we can tell, is very much in, but she's still trying to figure out what to do about her DNA test. The New York Times, nearly 2 months after Ms. Warren released the test results and drew hostile reactions from prominent tribal leaders, the lingering cloud over her likely presidential campaign has only darkened. Conservatives have continued to ridicule her. More worrisome to supporters of Ms. Warren's presidential ambitions, she has yet to allay criticism from grassroots progressive groups, liberal political operatives, and other potential 2020 allies who complain that she put too much emphasis on the controversial field of racial science, and in doing so, played into Mr. Trump's hands. So the media initially thought that being 0.something% proved that Trump was wrong and she was right. Didn't turn out that way in the court of public opinion. What do you make of the fact that they're still trying to figure out what to do here? Seems very Hillary Clinton-esque about not knowing how to handle something that should be fairly simple.
Yeah, well, one of the Twitter cliches du jour is the idea of dunking on somebody.
Yes.
And this was a brick on a dunk. This was Warren going up with an open lane, doing a big windmill dunk, and the ball bouncing off the rim to half court. She thought this was going to be great. It wasn't, obviously. I mean, what's interesting to me about it is, along the lines of that racial science stuff, on the progressive left, there's a kind of fight. You see this happening with trans people and their status, and you see it happening, to a certain circus sideshow extent with the Rachel Dolezals of the world. And Elizabeth Warren falls somewhere between, that's an odd comparison, but follow me, falls somewhere between the two. This battle between this kind of postmodern idea of identity construction, that you are what you identify as, and the sort of possibilities and the torturing of language that allows those possibilities to open up. And on the other hand, though, you have, of course, sort of a ranked intersectional grievance hierarchy, or to be more fair about it, I guess, sort of a difference of experience hierarchy that's doled out and assigned in a portion based on things like your ethnic identity. And so there's this tension there, which, on the one hand, you are what you say you are. On the other hand, there is this kind of creepy purity test that, is growing on the left to sort of gauge how much you deserve to be listened to and how much input you deserve to have in policymaking and politics and all sorts of other things. And in all those different areas, it's kind of like, watching the Spanish Civil War or something, or Iran versus Iraq. I mean, I don't think, whoever, it's less whoever, loses, we win. It's more whoever wins, we lose. But that's one interesting piece of it. And the other thing, of course, though, is what does it say about her chances? And I have always been a Warren skeptic as far as 2020 goes. I don't think she's particularly compelling. I think she's a disaster of a matchup. If you want to talk in terms of like a football matchup, it's not just sort of how good you are in a vacuum, it's how good you are against your given opponent. I think she's a disaster against the president. Also, she and there's numbers to back this up, because she underperformed in Massachusetts, this year. She was up this year and she underperformed. And she's not especially popular, either nationally or in her home state, compared to some of the other candidates. She has a little bit of a name recognition advantage, but there's not much else going on. And there are other people, sort of firebrand progressives of similar national stature, that, are more compelling than her and perform better. I mean, for at least 2-3 years, Gillibrand has been running for president. I think she's a better, even if she's a little bit sincere about her progressive turn, she's a more compelling and better retail politician than Warren is. And then there's kind of dark horses people started talking about recently, like Amy Klobuchar, who I think, again, would mop the floor with Elizabeth Warren. So I don't see a lane for her the way others do. And I think the whole brouhaha over her tribal identity is only another, nail in that coffin.
Well, speaking of Gillibrand, she was out with a tweet the other day, in fact, yesterday, that said, "Our future is female, intersectional, powered by our belief in one another, and we're just getting started." So she's fully on board with that train. And for those of traditional American
staffers are, I think she's just so utterly insincere. This is somebody who had like an NRA A+ rating 6 or 7 years ago. Her turn to the left is so insincere, and it took all of my strength not to actually her and say, "Actually, Senator, temporality doesn't have a gender. The future." The concept of time is not gendered.
Oh, man. Jim and I have obviously talked about Elizabeth Warren from time to time. Just her personality. She just reminds me of the person in your homeowners association who always has their copy of the bylaws and realizes that your edging isn't quite right or there's a little bit of paint peeling on your trim. And she's just kind of the nitpicker who just nobody wants to see coming.
You offer her an iced tea and a finger sandwich and she threatens to sue you. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about Hopsy. Maybe Elizabeth Warren could use a good beer to lighten up. And, yesterday was the 85th anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition. So if there's ever been a better time to celebrate, I don't know of one. Hopsy, everyone knows that the only way to get beer at its best is straight from the tap. Hopsy brings beer on tap to the comfort of your own home. You don't have to go out to the bar to do this. It'll come right to you. And you can do it without the price tag that many beer drinkers have come to expect. Have your own beer bar at home with the Sub. It's a countertop appliance that fits neatly in your kitchen, bar, or living room.
That's right, Greg. Think of Hopsy as an espresso for beer or a Keurig for beer. Whether you're a hophead, a malt mouth, or a palate partier, and I am all three, you can enjoy a variety of beer styles from big and small breweries around the country. They rotate monthly, and their IPAs, for instance, are very popular. And I think I can safely say that that's mostly with dudes because the last gender stereotype that exists is women, for whatever reason, do not like IPAs. But they're very popular with the dudes, at least.
I guess so. Well, Jim has been the one to try this out, and I've tried valiantly to explain why he likes it over the past couple of days. But then I said, hey, wait a minute. We have archives of this show. Why doesn't Jim just explain why he likes it, even though he's not here?
Look, obviously, if you're having a party, this is fantastic. This is neat. It's the sort of thing you want to show off to your friends and say, hey, come on over. We'll have a few. But I've been thinking about also what's nice about having this machine is that, a couple of months, NFL playoffs start. I certainly won't be watching the Jets in them. But let's say I decide to sit down and have some. Maybe I got people over, maybe I don't. But if I feel like having a beer, it's not like you go into the fridge and, there's nothing wrong with bottled beer or canned beer. It's perfectly fine. But we all like it from the tap. You go to a restaurant, you see what's on tap. It tastes better. It tastes fresher. And I've got it now in my house. And as you mentioned, they have a nice variety. I liked the porter. I liked the stout even more. Ordered some kind of lighter, happier ales and stuff like that for the holiday party coming up. So you've got a nice variety. And as I mentioned, they try to match you with breweries that are close to you, so you're getting some nice, fresh options.
So to get the Sub Home Draft Machine, 2 mini kegs of beer, which is equivalent to 2 6-packs, 2 Hopsy glasses, and free membership in the monthly beer club for $99, go to tryhopsy.com/martini and use the promo code Martini. Terms and conditions apply. Tryhopsy, tryhopsy.com/martini. Promo code Martini.
Greg, that was a microaggression, by the way, because I am part of the small band, inexplicably, of DC conservatives who are diehard Jets fans, and we are a very unhappy lot. So I didn't appreciate hearing that. Trigger warning I need next time. But Phil Klein is like a huge Jets fan, and if anyone knows Phil Klein over at the executive editor over at the Washington Examiner, if anyone knows him, they know that he's already kind of a morose Eeyore-ish personality, and then when the Jets start to fail, it only intensifies. So there's a little crew of us in D.C. that sometimes are masochistic enough to get together and watch Jets games, and then I think the whole world of conservative punditry suffers for it the following Monday.
Well, that could be. Well, be responsible with your Hopsy if you're watching Jets games, because the past several weeks have not been kind. So make sure that you're in good shape when you get to work Monday morning, to say the least. All right, on to our bad martini now, Dan. And yesterday we mentioned that Wednesday was the National Day of Mourning for the late President George H.W. Bush, the funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. We can kind of sprinkle in our thoughts about that here as well as we get into the bad martini. I think anyone with a pulse certainly choked up at the end of George W. Bush's eulogy for his dad, and just a great setting and a powerful tribute in a lot of different ways to a man who made a big difference. I particularly like the fact that the former Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney, took the time to explain how the end of the Cold War could have gone a whole lot worse and a whole lot more bloodshed could have happened without the expertise of George Bush on the scene and obviously his leadership in the Gulf War and beyond. So, of course, the media, even though Donald Trump's name was never even mentioned in the service, they say the service was really all about Trump, even though it wasn't. In fact, the Politico headline is, Bush's funeral wasn't about Trump, but of course it was. The memorial service, John Harris writes, for George H.W. Bush was a perfectly civil and eminently civilized event. And if one was listening in a literal-minded way, it all sounded like a grand exception to life in modern Washington. 2 hours of stories and tributes that were entirely bereft of political tension. The only way to listen in a literal frame of mind, of course, was through some equivalent of self-lobotomy, to be willfully oblivious of context, guileless in a way that certainly does not describe Bush or any of the people he chose to speak at his farewell. The service was replete with praise for the 41st president that could, with just the slightest nudge of interpretation, be heard as implied rebuke of the 45th president. But only implied, never explicit. This, unlike almost everything else in American politics today, was not about Donald Trump. And yet it very much was. Speakers rhapsodized about Bush's natural good cheer and optimism, his willingness to share credit and accept blame, his preference for self-deprecating humor, his gift for personal diplomacy, his loyalty to friends when they were down, his talent at assembling international coalitions, his mistrust of unthinking partisanship, his inaugural address in which he said that Americans must judge our lives by kindness to friends and neighbors rather than the pursuit of a bigger car, a bigger bank account, his commitment to truth and living up to the obligations of a gentleman. Not done there. CNN did 2 segments on the Jake Tapper show yesterday, 2 whole segments with a roundtable on the body language of Trump as he greeted the Obamas and glanced, I guess, towards the Clintons. But that wasn't enough. Over at MSNBC, Peter Baker, the New York Times White House correspondent, saying this.
There were other moments, too. You know, Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada, talked about the importance of NATO. He talked about the importance of NAFTA, both things that President Trump, who was just sitting about 10 feet away at that point, has questioned or criticized. And I think that there was, this discussion of finding the best in people and reaching out to people. Again, it was a testament to President Bush, but also it's hard not to hear that and watch the current president and wonder about the very different style of politics.
And Michael Beschloss, the presidential historian, with Nicole Wallace.
Someone had given a eulogy like that 5 years ago, and Mulroney...
2 years ago, right? 2 years ago.
And praised NATO. We would have probably been nodding off because what else would Mulroney do but praise
NATO? Now it's
NATO.
a headline.
Now it's a political act. If someone says George H.W. Bush was modest, it's a statement about Donald Trump. If someone says that, George W. Bush tried to reach across the aisle, that's what most people have done during most of American history, but hard to say it without it seeming like, I guarantee you that Donald Trump, I'm sure he took those things as insults rather than realizing that people were just saying what they were going to say.
Dan, if you want to compare the personality and the character, personal and otherwise, of Trump and Bush, I would personally agree that Bush clearly comes out on top. You can debate administrations and everything like that as well. But I got to say, I didn't think about Donald Trump at all during the funeral for George H.W. Bush because it wasn't about Donald Trump. It was about George H.W. Bush, his personal life, his professional life, his life in service to this country. And the fact that some people can never shut off that switch just drives me crazy.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And mainly it was just depressing for Bush and the Bush family and myself personally to watch it because, they cut to the president every 30 seconds to get his reaction shot. And, social media was full of all these amateur photo analyst, body language expert pictures of him greeting the Clintons and the Obamas. Look, I do want to say that there's a kernel of truth in the idea that you can't hear all of these virtues about George H.W. Bush without contrasting them with the current occupant of the office. What's sort of over the top and dishonest about it is the way that fits and is of a piece with the way the media has fed the Trump monster since 2015, at least. the president is very good at making everything about himself, and the press is all too happy to oblige it. And you get this spiraling positive feedback loop that just makes things worse and worse and worse. I say all the time, and I mean it, America loves this administration and is deeply entertained by it. And I mean 80% of America. I mean the 44% who are trying to vote for him and most of the people who hate his guts. They watch it the same way they watch The Real Housewives. They're deeply entertained by it. They can't get enough of it. They only wish there were more primetime hours in the cable news day to see more of it. So I think, there is, on the one hand, I get it, at a basic level, but on the other, somebody has to take their foot off the accelerator at some point and be a grown up and do the right thing. I don't have any confidence that's going to happen. And the other thing too is, maybe I was the only guy who was also hearing a lot of what was said about Herbert Walker and contrasting it with Bill Clinton, for instance, the man who beat him. When you heard a lot about his personal virtues or his steadfastness and constancy with Barb, or the way he, again, took blame and shared credit, the way he viewed his role as commander-in-chief and the great weight and seriousness with which he took that, contrast to Bill Wag the Dog Clinton, who lobbed a cruise missile at a janitor in East Africa and thought he ended the threat from Al-Qaeda. I mean, there were a lot of things that I saw that I contrasted, with Obama, with certainly with Clinton, and with the current president, to be fair. But I agree with you. It's just a depressing spectacle that we take a national day of mourning and make it about 45 again.
And they're all projecting because they say, well, Trump had to be noticing this. Trump never said a word. He never tweeted about it. Maybe he will. I don't know, but probably won't at this point. I
have to say, though, there was a funny headline or something yesterday to the effect that Trump gets praise for not ruining funerals.
It's all about where you set the bar, isn't it? All right, let's move on to our crazy martini now. And speaking of Trump and speaking of 2020, since we talked about that in our first martini, some speculation growing now about whether the ticket of Trump-Pence will be around for 2020. Now, take it with a grain of salt because this is from Vanity Fair, but here's what it says. On Monday, Trump hosted a 2020 strategy meeting with a group of advisors. Among the topics discussed was whether Mike Pence should remain on the ticket given the hurricane-force political headwinds Trump will face. As demonstrated by the midterms, a source briefed on the session told me. They're beginning to think about whether Mike Pence should be running again, the source said, adding that the advisors presented Trump with new polling that shows Pence doesn't expand Trump's coalition. He doesn't detract from it, but he doesn't add anything either, the source said. This is Gabriel Sherman writing, by the way. Dan, I think the bottom line here is it really doesn't matter who Trump's vice president is, as long as it's not someone who has a completely odious reputation. As we learned in 2016, I think Pence certainly helped to shore up the conservative base. But at this point, it's a litmus test on Trump and possibly on who his opponent is, just like it was in 2016. I'm not sure the running mate's going to matter all that much. So the fact that Pence doesn't move the needle much doesn't shock me at all.
Yeah, I think we've learned in recent cycles that VP nominees can be hindrances, but they're very rarely strengths. I mean, sort of going back to Quayle, you can think about Cheney, certainly in the reelect among a certain band of moderate voters, didn't like him. Biden is just kind of there. And, you think of Sarah Palin, obviously, as a potential detractor, although, you could argue that, even at the worst of it, Palin fired up a segment of the right space, but probably not much. And so I agree with you that I think, VP nominees are kind of just there. Pence has been a functional empty suit for the president. I do think it's kind of funny that, it's yet another example of expecting loyalty but not returning it if these reports are true. And again, who knows if they are. What I think is most interesting about it, though, is that, of course, he can fire his attorney general. He can fire any cabinet officer, but he can't fire his vice president, right? That's a constitutional office. It would be hilarious if the constitutional crisis that we had, rather than anything to do with the Mueller investigation, was that Trump wanted somebody else to run with him in 2020, and Pence just acted like he was running for re-election anyway. I'd be curious to talk to a constitutional scholar about what would happen there. I guess I can't think of anybody who would expand the Republican coalition from 2016 who would also agree to run. I think they're going to be sort of interchangeable. I mean, he could go with some sort of gimmicky sideshow nominee, someone from the cable news world or celebrity world, I don't think that nets him any more support than he would have had if he was running with a tuna fish sandwich. So I agree with you.
Some folks are speculating Nikki Haley, but she has said she's not going to be running for anything in 2020, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, I'm not sure who else would even be on the radar screen at this point.
One wild card, Greg, though, is if the Democrats move the ball a long way towards impeachment in the next 2 years, or if the facts on the ground change and everything we've seen with the Mueller investigation, there doesn't appear to be any smoking gun or any big evidence collusion. If that were to change and you're really close to impeachment or you're a few votes away in the Senate or something like that, then I could see the Republican base, the sort of conservative base, caring a lot about the quality of the VP nominee. But that's a lot of ifs.
Trump likes upheaval, so we'll see if this actually has any legs to it. A long way to go before, obviously, the Republicans need to nominate anyone formally. Dan, always good to be with you. Talk to you again tomorrow.
Sounds good, Greg.
Dan Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online, in for Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And don't forget to visit our friends over at Hopsy. Try Hopsy.com/martini, promo code martini. And join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.